is Thomas Edison, late in his life. And that's why I'm doing the lecture, because he invented the light bulb, which changed a lot the way that we are living. Because humans, as everything on Earth, every living creature on Earth, actually, we follow a pattern of light and day. And this changed the last, more or less, 100-something years. So I'm going to talk about light and sleep and cancer, and discuss why circadian rhythms are important, and discuss the findings we have on circadian disruption and cancer. But I will refer to to cardiometabolic diseases actually also. This issue came into the media in 2007 when IARC, the WHO organization that evaluates carcinogens, classified night shift that involves circadian disruption as a probable carcinogen. So probable carcinogen is the second strongest classification. Group 1 carcinogens are tobacco, asbestos, papillomavirus, whatever. And then you have the second categorization, which is a probable, which is also regulated. Most of the probable carcinogens are actually regulated by the European Union and by the corresponding agencies in Japan, the US, etc. So they classified as probable carcinogen, and it was sort of a surprise. And they did that based on IARC evaluates all the evidence we have. It's not only epidemiological evidence. They evaluate also animal data, lab data. So, and it's a sum of all the evidence. So this evaluation was based on very strong animal data, and I'll show you a summary, and limited epidemiological evidence. They have, again, a categorization, so it's not very strong. It is limited. It's not inexistent, but it's limited. So, and it was for breast cancer. And the evidence in animals was very clear. You produced, you did jet lag to the rats, and they did breast cancer. You put light at night to the female rats, and they did breast cancer. So very clear evidence. So if you seize the summary, this is a summary of the evidence that IARC evaluated 10 years ago, and it is not very frequent that you get a very consistent pattern. Nearly all the experiments that have been done, some of them using extreme protocols, but nearly all the experiments that were done in animals gave positive results, which is very preoccupying. This is not as common. You get this pattern for some very well-known carcinogens, it's true. But for many other carcinogens, you get, 2 positive and 10 negative. And we still classify them as animal carcinogens. Here, nearly all of them, 19 out of 20, were positive. And they used different protocols. They did jet lag, they did dim light, they did strong light. And they were just very convincing. And when you have this type of findings, the most probable is that actually it affects humans also, if you give enough dose. So, apart from the cancer data, you have very strong and very interesting findings in animals on cardiometabolic. So the mice are night animals, so they eat at night. So in this experiment, in experiments you can control for genetic variation. You have knockout mice, they're exactly the same. Everything is exactly the same. You give them the same hypercaloric diet. And if you give the diet at the correct time, at night, they gain weight, but not much. You give the diet during the day, which is the wrong time for the mice, and they become obese. And the reason is that they cannot metabolize. It is they are conditioned, as we are, to function differently day and night, which obviously poses also an issue about what happens with us if we don't eat in the day and we eat at night. So the questions following IARC's evaluation is, first of all, is it true this for humans? Or maybe it's confounding. We know that people who work at night, many years, they tend to be a bit different from people working at day in many aspects. And we'll talk in a minute about that. So maybe it's uncontrolled confounding. And then the other issue is, how big is the risk? We're talking about breast cancer. We are very, very common cancer. So even if the risk is not very high, we may be very interested because it's a very common cancer. Then the other thing is it only breast cancer? There are other hormone-related cancers. That, prostate is the obvious other one. Is it only cancer? The animal data tells us that we have very strong data for cardiometabolic outcomes. There's an issue about the mechanism, and we're interested about the mechanism because it can give us clue also not only for understanding whether it's causal, but also about the prevention. If it's only via melatonin, it's different than if it affects sex steroid hormones or if it goes from other pathways. And if we know the mechanism and there is an effect, how can we prevent it? There's no way that we will go back to how we were 150 years ago. We are in a 24-hour society. It's like that. So the issue is not that we will tell to people, don't work at night, don't stay late. The question is there an effect? And if there is an effect, can we do something to prevent? Which is not obvious. And then, are there legal aspects? One of the Denmark actually, and the Netherlands have changed the legislation on the basis of these findings. And they have regulated in a different way and in some aspects of night work. Other countries have not done it. But obviously, if it's proven that a nurse who works 20 years in night shift and gets breast cancer, if this is accepted as an occupational disease, then it enters among the diseases that are compensated for. And then, okay, we're talking about an occupation, which is a big change. You work at you work at night. You should be sleeping at night. But we are living in a 24-hour society. So lots of things have changed, not only for the workers. Many things have changed about us. So when you go to bed and you stay reading for 1 hour from your tablet, this we didn't do even 10 years ago. And it may be okay, but reading from your tablet means you are exposed to blue light, which decreases your melatonin, basically. And we don't know if this is good or bad. But it does make a change that has been measured. So I'll give an introduction to circadian disruption. I will present the evidence, the human evidence we have on cancer, cardiometabolic, and hormonal outcomes, and then talk a bit about prevention. So that was the situation 150 years ago. And for those of you who work in Africa, you fly and you go to Kampala, and as you arrive, it's really like that, basically. And that's, how it is. This is Florence. And, things have really changed. We have done something, changed our life, for the better, obviously. It's good to have electricity and light. But it may have some effects also. And it is important to know that night shift, well, many of us are from the health sector, so we know it. But, night shift is very common in our societies. We have about 15–20% of the population who are doing shift work, and there are a very considerable number who has always done night shift. And this is from the European survey, so it is a big survey in the EU. And there are some occupations, this is the purple that we are interested, hotels, health, transport, that are clearly occupations that have a lot of night workers. And this will be like that, it will not change. So what is the issue that we are looking at? We have a situation where the external time is coinciding with the internal time. You go to sleep at 11 o'clock and you wake up at 6 o'clock when the light comes up, and you are synchronized. The issue we're talking about is this one, when you have the external time and the internal time that are different. And this happens when we go to the States from here. or it happens when we work night shift, or it may happen for social reasons, because you stay late, partying, or because you like staying late. So your internal clock doesn't correspond to the external clock. So this is what we are looking at. And we know that we have a circadian pattern. All the living creatures of the world have a circadian pattern depending on the rotation of the world around its axis. All the living creatures. And we know, for example, that the lowest temperature in the body is at about 4 o'clock in the morning. And we know that our blood pressure goes very quickly up at about 6:30 in the morning. And so that's why you have also some of the cardiometabolic things happening at that time, etc., etc. And this, in fact, when we change from here, we go to Japan. After some days, we can adjust on the basis of the external information we get, of the light. So we can adjust to these changes. And circadian rhythms affect many processes, hormones, autonomous processes, body temperature, melatonin, cortisol, and lots of genes. About 30% of the genes actually follow a pattern. So if you have 30% of the genes following a pattern, this means that you affect lots of different pathways in the organism. And you have a central regulator, the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the base of the brain, which controls all the organism, but then you actually have peripheral clocks. So when we go to the States and you have jet lag, your central clock adapts fairly quickly to the light, to the different hour. Some of your internal clocks adapt later. So among the reasons why you have a feeling of not being well and you have gastrointestinal also symptoms is because your different clocks are not synchronized. There are lots of studies on molecular pathways. It's very well described how it works. There are key genes and they work with a loop. So they express themselves, and then through a loop they inhibit themselves in the end. I'm not going into details on that. And there are also a lot of research on immediate effects, which are obvious. If you work at night, you have more sickness absence, you have increased risk of injury. So, and the question is whether you do have more cancer, cardiometabolic, reproductive outcomes, or others. And there the findings are not as clear, actually. There are different pathways. It could be that shift work changes your lifestyle. And we know that people who work at night are a bit heavier, they smoke a bit more, they do less physical activity. So that's a pathway. We know that it affects your sleep. That's a different pathway, and sleep is important. We know that it affects melatonin. That's important also, because it has anti-cancer properties. And it may affect in different ways. So it's just not only one pathway, it's not only melatonin, it's multiple pathways. So let's see the human evidence. So this is what IARC had, this type of data. This is a forest plot. Here is one. They had a couple of studies more, but basically these are the ones they had. And they are mostly on air cabin crews and nurses. And if you look at the data, they're actually quite convincing. They're all positive, and it's about 50% increased risk for breast cancer. So it's not, and they still classified it as limited. And the reason why they classified it as limited is because the design of the studies was fairly basic for most of them, not all of them. Johnny Hansen had some very, very good studies, and Eva Schönhammer also. But many of the other studies had very limited control findings, so you were not really sure what's happening. Otherwise, this is pretty convincing. So it was classified as limited. We have many more studies now, and I'll show a couple of them. This is one of the big studies I'm doing in Spain with about 6,000 cases, different type of cases, colon, breast, prostate, and stomach, and leukemia, and about 4,000 population controls that we use for all the cases. Well, the men for the men and the women for the women, obviously. And we have analyzed all the cancer sites, but our a priori hypotheses were breast and prostate. And this is the largest study on prostate. And this is what we find. So, which is not very different from what other people finally have found for breast cancer. So the new studies, even for breast cancer, have not found 50% increased risk. They have found of the order of 20%, 20-ish%, so lower than what IARC had evaluated. And for prostate cancer, we find a slightly increased risk, not very, very high, about 15% increased risk. And then if you go to the workers who have worked many years as night workers, it goes up to about 40%, and there's some sort of a dose response. And it is, when I entered into this field after the IARC classified. I thought it was interesting, so I said I should start working. And I thought initially it would be easy to classify night and day workers, and actually it's very complicated. You ask people, are you a night, what type of work you do, and then they say, I'm a day worker, and then you ask, what time do you start working, and it's 4 o'clock in the morning. And on the basis of how they affect their circadian pattern, actually, they would be classified as a night worker. So you really have to get additional information if you want to classify people well. So, and there's a lot of differences between our studies. So now we're doing big pooled analysis to try to homogenize the exposure evaluation in all the studies. And then last year, and for breast cancer, the new studies were finding most of them about 20%. And then last year, Ruth Travis from Oxford published this very big study with about 500,000 women, and they found nothing for breast cancer. And there are some other very big studies that have found, with about 100,000 women, that have found 20-30% increase. So last year, we had this very big study. You can see the says, forever working on night is 1, and then you look at the dose response and there's nothing there. Which really just tells us, I think, that it's much more complex than what we thought. We started understanding that it's more complex, looking at the newer studies with better methodology. But it is, we don't get in humans the same results as in animals. And this is something we'll have to understand why it happened. This is a very good study. Equally good as the other ones. It's not that they have a lot of exposure misclassification, and that's why they don't find anything. This is a good group. And so the story about whether we have it in humans with this amount of exposure that we are looking at least, it is less clear. So if we look overall, we seem to have a more complex picture than what was evaluated 10 years ago. The largest study did not find an association. Many other new studies with very good exposure assessment actually have found association, not very high. We have 5 meta-analyses, 3 are positive, 2 are negative, depending on which studies you put in and which studies you kick out. And 3 years ago, we were I'm in the expert group for IARC, to suggest what they should do in the monographs. And we suggested they should be reevaluating night shift after we have a bit more evidence. Because in 2007, really the EPE was not really there. And now we really have a lot of EPE studies. So another issue that has come out a lot is whether we can identify susceptibles. And there has been a lot of discussion on genetic susceptibility. And we'll talk about in Friday about this, and those of you who do the module next week on genetics, you will get more of that. The idea is that you may work at night and you may be less or more susceptible depending on your makeup. So you have an effect of your genes, or you might have an effect of your exposures. So if you don't have the exposure, night shift in this case, you still may have an effect because you have some kind of genetic variant. And if you don't have the genetic variant, you still may have an effect of the exposure. And if you have both, you have a much bigger effect. This is the idea. We basically have only our study in Spain that has looked extensively. That's something we did with Ana Espinosa, who's helping here. And we found something, not much. And this is what most people do find when you do gene-environment interactions. Contrary to beliefs, you find something, not much. So we have all the circadian genes here, all of them. And we looked at different variants of the genes. And we did an analysis based on the variants, and we did an analysis based on the gene, and we do find significant results for gene environment. This is the p-value. We use p-value because we do lots of comparisons. So we have to adjust the p-value. We don't take 0.05. If you do 1,000 comparisons, you have to take this into account when you set your arbitrary p-value. So you do some kind of correction. So you take a 0.001, whatever, as corresponding to the arbitrary 0.05. So this is the corresponding, adjusted. And for the gene environment interactions, yes, we get some significant results, not much. And for the gene-based analysis, we also get some significant results. So there are some indications, but they are not very, very, very clear. And this is the only study that's around, so there's nothing more than that. But, in principle, if we get bigger numbers, we may be able to identify something more. So let's look at cardiometabolic outcomes. And the findings are actually, yeah.
So can I just ask, because I live in the Arctic, so we have 2 months of darkness
and
2 months of midnight sun.
Yeah.
Have there been done any studies if we have more or less cancer because we're exposed to so little sun or so much sun?
There are a few ecological studies, actually, that are all positive, based on, not so much on latitude, it's based on environmental light, based on satellite images. And if you do the same thing for that, you will do an ecological, basically, comparison, because people living in that part of the world are different from Spaniards in many things. They're not only different in that. So we would have to do something more than do a crude comparison if we wanted to make sense. But this is, and this is something that has not been really well done yet, but we should be doing it somehow. But it wouldn't work if you do just a very crude comparison between populations, because you have so many other differences. So cardiometabolic, this is the best, actually, meta-analysis, and they find about 20% increased risk for myocardial infarction. 20% increase for myocardial infarction is really a lot, because myocardial infarction is very common. And there's a dose response, and you find also the same for, this is again the big nurses' health study that was among the first studies to show also the association with breast cancer, and they have looked at cardiometabolic risks and on reproductive outcomes, and they find nothing for reproductive outcomes, but they have very clear findings for diabetes, and even when they adjust for body mass index, they still find an association. And there is also a meta-analysis for diabetes, and it's positive. And you also have the animal studies that are positive for this. So, we seem to be accumulating evidence. It's not all very clear, and for breast cancer, it's not at all clear, I think. But we seem to be accumulating evidence that shift work may be associated with a variety of effects. So what happens with us? Okay, the night shift workers is an extreme situation. They change, completely their pattern. But we stay until, 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock at night with light and with our tablets, and we may be waking early. So what's happening with us? So we have much, much less evidence about that. Very, very little evidence about effects of light in the general population. We are doing this now in Spain, and we have new ways of doing it. This is a photo from the Interspatial Agency of Barcelona, and at night. And we actually have the means to zoom in and identify the light with a 30 by 30 actually area. So we can identify the light in front of all the residents of all the people of our studies. And not only this is done by one of our postdocs, Ariadna Garcia, and she has worked in the models with a couple of astrophysicists, a very complex model. And not only this, but they actually can disintegrate the spectrum, so they can actually get an estimate of how much of the light is blue, which is the one that suppresses melatonin. And we have many more of this type of tools to play with the satellite mapping. It's a bit complex, the modeling. And we needed to have 2 astrophysicists to help us with that. But we actually did something that we couldn't have done, and which is identify how much light people have in front of their house, which doesn't mean that they have them in their house. Now, we analyze breast and prostate, and we have some very, very surprising findings. You don't have these findings because they are still not published. But we we have what you see here. So we have an estimate of light inside the house, and it's not a very good estimate, actually, the inside the house, because it's questionnaire based. So, you know, it would have been nice to have measured the light inside the house. And the measure outside the house, when we look at the blue light, actually it's also associated with both breast and prostate. And blue light actually penetrates much more than the red light. Blue light is the LEDs, the stuff we get from the LEDs, from the blue LEDs, which are the majority. So it penetrates much more curtains and whatever others. So we get these findings, and it is under review for a long time in a very good journal, and we'll see how it goes. I mean, they're very provocative, and I don't even know if it's true. It's nice to have it because it will stimulate more studies, and we'll see whether it remains, you know, as true. Yeah.
What do you see for other types of outdoor light?
For other,
yeah.
We don't see it for total intensity. Actually,
okay.
We don't see the association. But our hypothesis, and it was a true hypothesis, is not a posteriori hypothesis, but is that we should find an association for blue light because that's what suppresses melatonin.
Well, that's quite convincing, because if it was some confounding by socioeconomic status or something, you'd probably see it for all light.
Yeah. You know, what we don't have is how much of the blue light actually, you know, has reached the person. So we would have, in some of the other experimental studies, we actually are measuring the light, but these are studies with a few hundreds. This is, you know, with a few thousands. Yeah.
Then, let's say the hypothesis is true, then in 20 years you'd see an increase because the blue light is in your iPhone, in your tablet, in your phone, in your whatever you're, you know.
Well, we are much more exposed to this type of light, yeah. I mean, it will depend on the intensity, but already some of the electronic, you know, phones or whatever, they have a mode that decreases your exposure, actually. You can put the night mode in some of the phones.
But from a population view, who does that? And who knows?
Well, I do that.
Yeah. You know, but
Yeah, okay, you see? There. So we'll see whether this holds, what we found. You know, we'll have to get more studies and see whether it holds. And one has to be, you know, we gave a very cautious explanation when we sent it. The other thing that is interesting is, you know, the story of the diet. It is very, you know, the findings in the animals are really very intriguing. You know, the fact that you give the food the wrong time and it has, you know, it affects obesity. You know, lots of us are eating on the basis of, you know, circadian history. We are eating the wrong time. So, and there are some very nice papers, you know, talking about how different ways of eating, like this one, and they do experiments in animals on this, how it could affect. So if you have the big circles are big lunches, the small circles are small lunches, and the other circles, the yellow ones, are snacks. So how would this affect your health generally if you have lots and you eat at night, not during the day, as we were eating 200 years ago? You know, how would it affect if you have big lunches but you eat during the day? If you have fewer lunches, you know, what would happen if you don't eat? If you have some days that you don't eat? Actually, a number of the experiments in animals show that if you have some days that you don't eat, it's actually quite good for you. So I can go on and you skip supper. No. So there's nothing there skipping supper, so I cannot follow the scheme. So what we did is actually we looked at this. Our studies until now have looked at what you eat and how much you eat. And just now we start looking at when you eat. And there's a lot of, there are recommendations that you should eat breakfast. You know, that's what we tell to our children, because if you don't eat breakfast, you will not go well at school. And actually, if you look more carefully, many of these recommendations are not based on very, very strong evidence. If you scratch beneath the surface, many of these recommendations are based on very circumstantial evidence, in fact. So we looked at time in the Spanish study, and also time intervals, you know, between what time do you have your supper? Do you have it at night? Do you have it during the day? If you have your supper, do you go to sleep immediately, or you keep active? Because if you go to sleep, you go into a mode that is much less active than when you are awake. And And this is what we find both for breast and for prostate. I'm not showing the results for time, but we find an association with early time protective compared to late time. And we find this association between how much time is between your supper and your sleep. And we find that if you leave a couple of hours between your supper and your sleep, actually your risk decreases. And again, we'll see. This is, again, the first study finding this. But there is just now, I saw published an experimental study, not exactly the same, but finding something similar. So in terms of biology, it makes sense. Whether, again, it's true or not, we'll have to get a few more studies and see. But it does make sense in terms of biology that you eat when you're supposed to eat, and you manage to metabolize what you eat better than if you eat at midnight and you go to sleep immediately. Yeah.
Did you also compile obesity in this?
We're now analyzing obesity in the controls, and we don't find much. And obesity would have been actually one of our strong hypotheses, and we haven't finished the analysis, so it may be that we need to adjust for other things, but it's stronger for prostate and breast than for obesity. And if you had asked me before, I would have said it would be stronger for obesity than for prostate and breast, but things are, yes.
Are all these studies that have any kind of diet data based on surveys?
Yeah, we have extensive,
Stay up late, eat Funyuns and Cheetos, and then just eat poorly.
Yeah, but we adjust for, we have extensive dietary information, and we are, basically what we are doing, we are adjusting for dietary patterns. We have analyzed we have a very, very long questionnaire on food frequency questionnaire, the same as EPIC and as the Nurses' Health Study, more or less. And we adjusting all our models for dietary patterns that we have shown are important for this population. So it is. We have adjusted for dietary patterns. Well, not in this figure, but yeah, we have done it in alternative analysis. It's not so important. It doesn't affect this association. I mean, yeah.
So just a question, curiosity. It could be some impact the occupational status, because it just come to me that some occupational work, such as the medical doctor, they used to have some shift work, but also the bad habits not to have lunch, maybe breakfast.
Yeah. We have excluded all the night shift workers. We didn't want to mix up here. So these are people who may be working morning or afternoon, evening, but not night. Now, it starts becoming too complicated for that. And we actually have older dietary patterns, and it doesn't affect if you have 3 or 5 meals a day. We've checked that. And it doesn't affect very clearly whether you eat for 1 hour or for 30 minutes. Okay.
Wouldn't you then find a big difference between Mediterranean and, for example, Scandinavian countries? Because we tend to eat a lot.
That would be very interesting. So I want to get these results out so to see some other populations out. Actually, in Spain, we eat late, but we eat earlier than what people think, because our time, our real time is the time of England. We are below England. But we have the times of France and Germany and Italy. So we eat at 9, but in reality, we are eating 1 hour earlier. So it is not as bad as what people think. Okay, but we do eat late. So it would be very nice to get some other populations with different eating patterns. And, I'm not sure this is true. When you get, we have a lot of experiences in population studies that, we do this and we have not realized that there is some other confounding or whatever. I mean, we have adjusted for everything. We have looked at everything. It goes along with our biological theory, but we'll have to get some more studies out to see. The other issue that has been discussed is about what's called chronotype. We all know that some of us function better in the morning, some of us function better in the evening. I function better in the morning than in the late at night. And there are some methods to evaluate this. And more or less they work. How well they work, who knows? We have not found very, very clear findings on genetic components of chronotype. So there is an open questionnaire by a center in Munich that does this, and then another center in Holland that does the same. And you can enter, and they tell you you're a morning type or an evening type. And the idea is that if you are a morning type and you work at night, you don't adapt as much as if you are a late guy. If you're a night type, you can work at night and it's easier for you because your organism, your body is used to stay late. So whatever effects you may have, they will be less extreme. This is the theory. And it works for acute effects, for fatigue, for sleepiness. It works. The few studies that have looked at cancer, breast cancer, actually do not find it. We do not find a difference, consistent difference between morning and late type nurses and breast cancer or other workers who work at night. Yeah.
Is there a group which have an internal clock
That have?
a biological clock that is not synchronized with the light outside, that have 24 hours?
There are a lot of experimental studies, yeah. There are quite a few, whether there are studies that have looked at more detail in the biological clock. You can do that better in experimental studies where you get a group of people and you have them, sleeping in different times and this type of thing, and you change their sleep and you measure very well all the changes. Now, these type of studies have shown what I'm going to show in a minute. And there are studies that have looked, for example, on not only on hormones, on melatonin, but also on gene expression. And they have shown that you get exposure to blue light and you have quite a few genes that are expressed that should not be, and you have your sleep affected. And there are studies that have control. There are small studies. They are very difficult studies with 10 subjects. But they're very informative, actually. And they look at your biological clock, yeah. Okay, so let's look at some more studies in human, but some more experimental studies that look at hormonal changes. This is studies that we did with Kyriaki Papandoniou, who was a doctoral. There she is, a student at that time. Now she's an assistant professor in Vienna, and we did a study on morning and day workers in 2 hospitals, in the train company in Barcelona and in SEAT, the big car company in Barcelona. And this is not a very big study, and we had everybody we measured their light, and we got all the urine voids for 24 hours. We collected everything, and that's what we found for melatonin. And we don't, it's surprising, but we have very few studies showing this data even on melatonin. So this is the pattern. These are the real data, what we get, the model data. For our day workers, melatonin goes up sometime around 4 or 5 in the morning, and then it goes down. And this is what we find for our night workers. So melatonin, goes up. The top is when they sleep, which is during the morning. And so there is a shift. And if you look at the area under the curve, so how much they have, compared with the day workers, they have less melatonin. So it's not only that it moves, but they actually have less melatonin. So if melatonin is important for some of the cancer, this is a potential mechanism. And there are 2 or 3 more, very good studies like this one that show the same. The other thing that we did, which was really nice, was we looked at sex steroid hormones. If we're talking about breast and prostate, we're interested in some on progestogens, androgens, estrogens. And here what you get, and it's not a very big study, is night workers one is the day workers, and these are the levels for estrogens, progestogens, and androgens for men and premenopausal women. And results are not significant for individual hormones or their metabolites. But the pattern is that for progestogens and androgens, we get systematically higher levels among the night workers. And there is at least one more study, maybe two more studies, yeah, I think two, that have not done so many analyses, but they have found the same. One of them, the first one was actually this one. So night workers have lower melatonin and they have higher reproductive hormone levels. If this is true, this is very interesting because it means that we have a much bigger deregulation of endocrine system actually, which makes also sense if breast and prostate are real. So that's where we are. A couple of slides for adaptation and prevention, and then we go for supper. So this is what happens normally, for us. We sleep at night, and our melatonin goes up and then goes down. Now, if you stay awake at night, you are partying and you stay awake, this is what's going to happen. You're going to sleep during the morning next day, but for one night, your melatonin will not move. It will stay there. If you are working many nights, what will happen is you will adapt, and your melatonin will, as happens with the night workers, that their melatonin peaks in the morning, not at night. So, and here is an open question, and we are asked by the workers in the hospitals or in the industry, what are you recommending? Should we be working 1 month at night and then 1 month day, or should we be doing rapid rotation as we do in our hospital? In our hospitals, what we're doing, we have with both doctors and nurses, we have rapid rotation. So you do 2 nights and then you do 3 days, 3 nights, weekend, whatever. And actually what happens is that you never fully adapt. What we find, and that's what we found also in our study in the hospitals, but other people have found it also, that the nurses who do this rapid rotation, they keep their melatonin at night, even though they work at night. So it should have gone down. So is it good or is it bad? If the theory is that you should do that stuff, you should try to get your basic, your low temperature, your melatonin to follow your day-night pattern. And with rapid rotation, it's very difficult to do that. So it is, and we don't have real data for long-term effects. So we are asked, but we don't say. We cannot say anything at this point in time. The people with whom we are working now in the car factory, they are doing everything wrong, basically. And it's a big factory, it's a Volkswagen group, and they do everything wrong. They do rotation, which goes night, evening, morning. Everybody rotates. 9,000 workers. They have 14,000 workers in the plant. 9,000 rotate. Everybody rotates. And they go night, evening, morning, which is the wrong rotation. They should be doing night, morning, evening. They should do that type of rotation. And this we have very good data that it does affect at least immediately your health status. And they also they start working their day shift at 6 o'clock in the morning, which means that all the morning workers wake up at about 4:30, which means that they have messed up their circadian pattern, basically. And we're trying to convince them that they should change it, and this is not so easy. Although in Audi, they do it correctly in Germany. So, yeah, social adaptation. This is important because this comes out when we talk. When you talk with night shift workers, in that car factory or anywhere else, the problem, the shift that they don't like is not the night or the morning. The shift they don't like is the evening because of the problems with social adaptation. The night shift also gets paid more. So if they had asked who wants to do night shift, they would have enough volunteers because it's paid more. The shift that people don't like is the evening shift because it cuts you out from the society. All our social life is in the evening. Our kids come out of school, we go to the cinema, we eat with our family. So this is the shift people don't like. It probably has no biological effects, but it has social effects. So when we're talking about this type of changes, it's not only biology that we're talking about. So I think it's time to close. So circadian disruption in night shift work has been associated with several acute and chronic health effects, including cancer and cardiometabolic diseases. Whether it includes cancer or not, people have different views, obviously. Effects of light at night and mistimed lifestyle practices in the general population are poorly examined. We have really very, very few studies on that. Evaluation of mechanisms are important also to identify what recommendations we do. We are working with the Catalan government to do recommendations now. And it's, we can do some basic recommendations, but we cannot do more than basics, in fact. And they are mostly recommendations at the company level that are individual. Some individual recommendations, not much. And few of the recommendations that are going around are really based on data, which is not specific for this. Many of the recommendations we're giving are not evidence-based. And we do have to get some more evidence-based on recommendations. So that's it. That's my center. That's my institute.